Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of the Bloody Height. In the 135th year of the Common Reckoning, the army of Aristos retreated from Amnulcus Bridge, falling back toward Midhaven, followed by an army of orcs. Aristos sent messengers to Midhaven, calling the garrison he had left there to his aid. To the east of Midhaven, Dogopolitan farmland extended for some 20 miles, after which the fields were replaced by the tangled trees of the bosculous forest. Some miles further east, the trees petered out. This was the point at which Aristos chose to make his stand, atop a small hill at the eastern side of the forest, overlooking the bleak expanse of the Urgulan heath, over which the orcs had pursued him. Aristos had mustered all the forces available to him. He had 2 cohorts, each of 100 heavy infantry, all wearing armour, bearing a shield, and armed with a sword and a heavy javelin. There were 3 cohorts of unarmoured slingers and a cohort of unarmoured javeliniers. Every man of this light infantry was also equipped with a short sword and a shield. And there was a cohort of 100 armoured cavalry, with shields on their left arms and spears in their right hands, under the command of Nicatoris. Aristos' army also included some 100 Skelding exiles, all that remained of the Skelding force that had fought at the Battle of Amnulcus Bridge. These were mail-clad warriors, shield-bearing spearmen who fought on foot. Their leader was Osric. Aristos drew up his battle line atop the hill. On his right he placed Osric and the Skeldings, stationing himself with a cohort of heavy infantry in the centre, and the second cohort of heavy infantry on his left. In front of each of these 3 blocks of infantry he positioned a cohort of slingers. To the right of the hill, amongst the foliage of the bosculous forest, he concealed his javeliniers. Nicatoris and the cavalry took up a position on the other side of the hill, behind a stand of trees. The leader of the orcs was Garga. He rode on the back of a great wolf. Dogopolis was a long way from the Wolf Rock Mountains, and it was becoming increasingly rare for the orcs of Dogopolis to be so mounted. It may well be that Garga's unusual and ferocious steed had been an aid to him in defeating or cowing those among the orcan host who had opposed his leadership. That host consisted of some 700 armoured orcan infantry. Around 500 of these wielded the fearsome orcan bill. Most of the remainder carried a shield and a single-handed weapon, although some did brandish a 2-handed axe. Garga drew up his forces in 2 lines across the heath and pointed up at the Dogopolitan ranks, lining the height before him. "There are the dogs who attacked you," he cried. "There are the dogs who thought that they could steal your slaves and the lands you have rightfully won. They insult you with their very presence. Are you going to let their insolence go unpunished?" 700 orcs, let it be known that they were not. "Very well," shouted Garga. "There they are. Kill them all!" And, with a great roar, the orcan host surged forward. High on the hill, Aristos watched the orcs advance across the open heath. Closer and closer they came. And then, when Aristos judged the moment was right, he ordered the Dogopolitan trumpets to be sounded, blasting defiance, and, on this signal, a stinging cloud of slingshot rattled into the orcan formations. Gaps opened in the orcan lines, and some of the orcs recoiled, but the bulk of the host pressed on. The trumpets sounded again, and Nicatoris led his cavalry out from behind the trees, skirting the foot of the hill, heading into the plain to take up a position on the orcs' right flank. Again the Dogopolitan slingers let fly, lashing the orcs with yet more shot. But still the orcs came on. And now, on the Dogopolitan right, the Dogopolitan javeliniers emerged from the woods, threatening the orcs' left flank. Garga urged the bulk of the orcs to continue their advance up the centre, but he detached two contingents, one to cover each flank. Nicatoris and his cavalry found themselves faced by a formation of orcan bills, while the Dogopolitan javeliniers were charged by a snarling shield wall of sword-swinging orcan warriors. The javeliniers hurled volleys of javelins at their onrushing foes, but to no avail. The orcs closed with the javeliniers and wreaked a horrific slaughter upon them. On the other side of the battlefield, it was the Dogopolitans who took the initiative. Nicatoris recklessly led a cavalry charge into the ranks of bill-wielding orcs before him. Surprised by the audacity of the Dogopolitans, the orcs wavered and fell back. Nicatoris pressed them once more, but the orcs regained their composure and started to wield their bills with deadly effect, indiscriminately carving men and beasts alike. Nicatoris himself was hooked from his horse and hacked to death in the heather. And now Garga and the leading orcs rushed up the hillside, braving one last volley of slingshot before they crashed into the central group of Dogopolitan slingers. Aristos ordered the supporting cohort of heavy infantry into the fray, charging into the orcs, hurling their javelins and drawing their swords. The orcs were thrown back. Garga rode to and fro across the heath, regathering the scattered orcs, driving them forward, cursing them for their cowardice, reminding them of Dogopolitan disrespect, and urging them to bloody vengeance. Enraged and ashamed, the orcs once more surged up the hill, smashing into the Dogopolitan centre, chopping and slashing at everything in their path. And this time the Dogopolitan lines gave way. Many Dogopolitans were cut down. Aristos and the survivors retreated, falling back on the two cohorts of Dogopolitans to their left. On the opposite side of the hilltop, the Skeldings wheeled and formed a shield wall, facing the triumphant orcs. The orcs ignored the Skeldings. They wanted to kill Dogopolitans. Aristos frantically tried to draw up his men in a defensive formation. There was no time. A mad mass of bill-wielding orcs, berserk with bloodlust, fell upon the disorganised Dogopolitans. The Dogopolitans were no pushover. They gave a good account of themselves and slew many orcs. But the orcs kept coming, cutting swathes through the Dogopolitans until they reached Aristos and hacked and hewed him to death, and then into pieces. Staggered by the savagery of the orcan assault and the gruesome mutilation of their leader's corpse, for a moment it seemed that the Dogopolitan ranks would disintegrate. But the Dogopolitans were not only fighting for their own lives. They were fighting to protect their mothers, wives and children back in Midhaven. They had now seen the ferocity of the orcs at first hand and had no desire to subject their loved ones to a similar experience. Osric had observed these proceedings. He had no great hope of winning the battle, but he was tired of running, and in any case had nowhere to run to. He ordered his spearmen to advance across the heights and fall upon the rear of the orcs. Grim-faced the Skeldings came on, determined to sell their lives dearly. There was but one factor in their favour. Garga was not expecting them to attack. He was focused on regathering his forces, preparing for a final charge that would completely obliterate the remnants of the Dogopolitan left and centre. Before he knew what was happening, the Skeldings had closed with him, and Skelding's spears were thrusting at surprised orcs. Garga was no coward. He and his bodyguard turned to face this unexpected assault, but the Skeldings overwhelmed them. Garga and his great wolf both met their end in that fight, pierced by many Skelding spears. If Osric thought that killing Garga would win him the day, he was sadly mistaken. Previously, orcan anger had been directed at the Dogopolitans. Now that wrath was redirected against the Skeldings. The Skeldings discovered that orcan bills hit hard, and that shields and mailcoats provide little protection against them. The Skeldings were outnumbered and soon surrounded. Now it was Osric who saw his bodyguard cut down around him, and then he suffered the same fate as Aristos. Shortly thereafter, all of the Skeldings who had followed him to war were dead. Thus was Garga swiftly avenged, and once more the orcs turned their attention to the Dogopolitans. The valiant but hopeless Skelding assault had enabled the surviving tatters of the Dogopolitan left and centre to regroup and close ranks. It did them no good. The orcs fell upon them, and once more the grassy hilltop was watered with Dogopolitan blood. And now the only survivors of the Dogopolitan army were the 100 slingers on the Dogopolitan right, who prepared to make a last stand on the shoulder of the hill that would afterwards be known as the Bloody Height. Those slingers had not been idle. A hail of slingshot had already driven back an attack up the hill by the orcan warriors who had so roundly defeated the Dogopolitan javelineers. The slingers had then turned to face up the slope and hurled their shot at the orcs who were slaughtering their kinsmen. This caught the orcs' attention, and they turned their faces to this new foe. The first orcan charge down the hill did not reach the slingers. It was repulsed by several well-directed volleys of slingstones. But while the slingers were thus distracted, the orcan warriors at the bottom of the hill took the opportunity to regroup and return to the fray. While the slingers watched the orcs above them reform in preparation for a second assault, the orcs below charged up the hill and into the slingers' rear. The slingers turned to meet this new threat, meeting steel with steel. Sword blades swung and clashed, shields were split, and helmets rang from many blows. The fighting was fierce, but the Dogopolitans stood firm, and the orcs retreated back down the slope. The respite thus won was only temporary. The orcs atop the heights charged down the hill once more, and this time the exhausted Dogopolitans could not stand. The slingers' formation broke, and the rampaging orcs overran them in a final scene of horrific carnage. The orcs suffered many, many casualties that day, but they obtained the desired recompense for Dogopolitan disrespect. Not a single man of Aristos' army ever returned to Midhaven. Thus ended the Battle of the Bloody Height.